Imagine stepping into a library, the familiar scent of old books filling the air, only to realize that something is off. You might hear whispers from the shelves, feel eyes watching you, or even discover that the stories in those books are more real and terrifying than you could ever imagine. These chilling encounters are sure to haunt you long after you turn off the lights. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we've got 3 spine-tingling, real-life library horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. Get ready for some truly disturbing encounters that will make you question the very nature of libraries. Story 1, The Library Phantom by Lisa Roberts. My name is Lisa Roberts, and I've always been a lover of libraries. The smell of old books, the quiet atmosphere, and the sense of peace they bring. There's nothing quite like it. That's why when I got a part-time job as a librarian at a local library during college, I was beyond excited. Little did I know, I was about to encounter something I could never have imagined. It all started on a cold autumn afternoon. The library had recently undergone some renovations, and I was tasked with organizing the newly updated sections. I was alone that day. It was just me, the dusty shelves, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above. I enjoyed the solitude, but it was soon clear that I wasn't entirely alone. Around 4:30 p.m., a chill swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight and the heat was on. It wasn't unusual for the library to get a little drafty, but this felt different. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the old building settling. But as the cold air persisted, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I was being watched. I decided to take a break and walk down to the staff room to grab some coffee. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The shelves in the back corner of the library, which I had just organized, were completely disheveled. Books were knocked over, some were even pulled out of place, as if someone had been rummaging through them in a hurry. I couldn't remember anyone else entering the library, and the doors had been locked. I assumed it was just an accident, or perhaps a prank by one of the other staff members. But the longer I spent in the library that evening, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. As I worked, I began to hear faint footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate steps that would stop whenever I turned around. But there was never anyone there. The strange thing was, the footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from the floors. More like they were echoing from the walls themselves, almost like the sound was traveling through the library. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I'd been working long hours and I was exhausted, but the sounds continued, growing louder as the evening went on. Then I heard something else, a whisper. It was so soft, so faint, that I thought I had imagined it. I paused, straining to hear, but all was silent again. But then it came again, a whisper, almost like a voice, but too far away to understand. I froze, looking around the room. The library was empty, as far as I could tell. There was no one there but me. Yet it felt as though I wasn't alone. I decided to investigate the source of the sound. Slowly, I walked through the aisles of bookshelves, the noise of my footsteps muffled by the carpeted floor. As I turned the corner into a darkened section of the library, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the far end of the aisle stood a figure, tall, dark, and motionless. I froze in my tracks, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there staring at me. I could barely make out its features, but I could tell it wasn't anyone I recognized. It looked like a man, but his features were shrouded in shadows as if the light itself refused to touch him. I called out, my voice shaky, but the figure didn't respond. I took a tentative step forward, and that's when I noticed the odd thing. The air around the figure seemed to shimmer, almost as if it was distorting the light around it. My gut told me to run, but I couldn't look away. The figure stayed still, its presence both unsettling and hypnotic. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from across the room. I spun around in alarm, only to find that the figure had disappeared. The room was empty, the silence almost deafening. I quickly rushed over to where the noise had come from, only to find that it was just a shelf of books that had fallen over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had somehow caused it, that it had been a warning. By the time I finished cleaning up the mess, the sun had set, and the library's fluorescent lights flickered ominously. I was about to lock up and leave when I noticed something else. On the desk near the circulation desk, there was a book that hadn't been there before. It was an old leather-bound volume, covered in dust, and it was open to a page that looked like it had been recently read. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was the same book I had been cataloging earlier that day. I closed the book, but as I did, I saw something scrawled in the margins, something that made my blood run cold. The writing wasn't in any language I could recognize, but there was one clear message: the library knows you. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly stuffed the book into my bag. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered something far darker than I had intended. I locked up and hurried out of the library that night, but the sense of unease never left me. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice more strange occurrences. Books would be out of place when I came in the next morning, whispers would echo through the halls when no one was around, and occasionally I'd see glimpses of that same dark figure out of the corner of my eye. I never told anyone what happened that night, afraid that they'd think I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. To this day, I avoid that library whenever I can. And when I walk by it on my way to work, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing in the window, waiting for the next person to enter. So if you ever find yourself in a library late at night and you hear a whisper from the walls, you might want to turn around and leave. You never know who or what could be watching you. Story 2, The Forgotten Shelf by Daniel Clark. My name is Daniel Clark, and I've always loved spending time in libraries. As a child, I spent hours in the local library, losing myself in books. So when I landed my first job as a library assistant, I thought it was the perfect fit. It was a quiet, peaceful place, and I had the freedom to roam through the stacks whenever I needed a break. But my time working there took a dark turn one afternoon, and I've never been able to look at the library the same way since. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when it all began. I was working the evening shift, which meant the library was nearly empty, except for a few patrons here and there. The building was old, and the air always smelled of aged paper and wood, a comforting scent I had come to associate with safety and tranquility. My job was simple enough: shelve books, help patrons, and maintain the order of things. However, on that day, I noticed something strange. As I was shelving books in the back corner of the library, I stumbled upon a section I had never seen before. It was tucked away behind a tall row of shelves, hidden from the usual view. The area was dusty, and the shelves themselves were covered with years of neglect. The books on these shelves were old, their leather covers cracked and worn, and they looked out of place compared to the more recent books I was used to handling. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take a closer look. One book in particular caught my eye. It was a large, heavy volume that was placed in the farthest corner of the shelf. Its title was illegible. The gold lettering on the spine faded with time. I reached for it, and when I pulled it from the shelf, I noticed how thick and ancient it was. The book seemed oddly warm to the touch, and the pages felt unusually smooth, as if someone had just read it moments ago. I hesitated before opening it, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I flipped open the cover, I found it blank. No introduction, no contents page, nothing. Just a blank page staring back at me. I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was an old book, probably just a strange artifact from some forgotten time. But then, as I turned the pages, I noticed something unsettling. The further I went, the more the pages seemed to change. What started as blank pages soon began to fill with writing that I didn't recognize. It wasn't in any language I had ever seen, but the more I read, the more familiar it felt. The symbols began to swim on the page, forming words in a language that felt almost hypnotic, as though it was calling to me. I couldn't stop myself from reading it, even though something deep down told me I should put it down and walk away. The words seemed to tug at my consciousness, pulling me further into the pages. I reached the middle of the book, and there it was, a page filled with strange symbols. But this time, there was a drawing. It was a crude yet detailed sketch of the library. In the drawing, the shelves and aisles were all in their correct places, but something was off. There in the back corner of the library, where I had just found the book, was a strange dark shape. It didn't resemble anything I recognized, just a shadow, a dark figure that loomed ominously in the corner of the page. My heart began to race as I stared at the drawing. I felt a sudden urge to look behind me, but when I did, there was nothing there. Just the same dusty, quiet library I had known for years. But as I turned back to the book, the page seemed to shimmer for a moment, and the shadow in the drawing seemed to flicker. I could swear it was moving. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like someone was moving through the shelves behind me. I froze. There were no other patrons in the library that night, so I knew it wasn't anyone I had missed. I stood still, my breath shallow, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. It was getting closer. I slowly placed the book back on the shelf and turned toward the noise. There, at the end of the aisle, I saw a figure standing in the dim light. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His face was shadowed, but I could see that he was tall, with broad shoulders, and he was dressed in old-fashioned clothes I had never seen anyone wear in the modern age. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The man didn't move. He just stood there staring at me. The silence between us stretched on, suffocating. And then he spoke. "You've found it, haven't you?" His voice was deep and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. I couldn't make sense of what he was saying, but I knew that he wasn't referring to the book. It was something else, something much darker. His eyes were the only thing I could see clearly, and they were cold, empty, like they had seen too much. I didn't want you to find it, he continued, his voice sending chills down my spine. But now that you have, there's no turning back. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a cold gust of air rush past me. It wasn't the same kind of cold I was used to in the library. It was sharp, biting, and it seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The man took another step, and this time, I could see that his face was pale, his skin ashen, as if he hadn't been alive in years. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words never came. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Before I could react, the man disappeared, vanishing into thin air, as if he had never been there. The library was silent once again, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I ran to the front desk and locked the doors behind me. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. The library held secrets, and some things were better left forgotten. I never went back to that section of the library, and I never looked at that book again. But sometimes, when I walk through the library and glance at the back corner, I swear I see a shadow flicker, and I hear the faintest rustle of pages turning. Story 3, The Whispering Books by Anna Parker. My name is Anna Parker, and I've been a librarian for over 10 years. I've worked in various libraries, from small community branches to large, sprawling archives. But none of them were as eerie as the one I worked at in my early career, the old library in a forgotten corner of town. I'll never forget my first shift there. It was the dead of winter, and the library was tucked away in a quiet, desolate part of town. The building was ancient, its stone exterior worn and chipped, and the air inside always had a chill to it, even when the heating was running. Still, I loved the quietness of it, the stillness that enveloped me as I cataloged books in the evenings after the few remaining patrons left. It had a charm to it, though it was a bit too quiet for my liking sometimes. I had been assigned the evening shift, which meant I was the last person to leave. The library would close at 9 p.m., and my job was to make sure the books were shelved and the building was locked up tight. But during my second week, something happened that changed everything for me. It started innocently enough, as most things do. I was working late, sitting in the back office sorting through old archives when I heard what I thought was the sound of pages turning. It wasn't unusual for the library to make noises, creaking floors, the occasional settling of old bookshelves. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, like someone flipping through a thick book, and it was coming from the main reading room. I wasn't sure if I had heard it at first. I paused, straining to listen, but the noise stopped. Thinking it was just the wind or the building settling, I shrugged it off and returned to my work. But it wasn't long before the sound came again, louder this time. A faint rustling noise followed by a whisper. I froze. I had always believed in the supernatural to some degree, but this was absurd. I was alone in the building. There was no one else there, and yet the whispering continued. It was soft at first, like the wind slipping through the cracks in the old windows. But as I stood up and made my way toward the reading room, the whispering grew clearer, more distinct. It was coming from the bookshelves. When I stepped into the room, the whispering stopped, and the silence was almost suffocating. I stood in the middle of the room, scanning the aisles of books. There was no one there, no explanation for the eerie sound I had heard. I couldn't help but feel a chill creeping over me, but I brushed it off. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I returned to the back office, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as the hours wore on, the whispering grew louder, as though it were following me. No matter where I went in the library, the books seemed to murmur, calling out to me. The rustling of pages, the soft, hushed voices became impossible to ignore. And then, one evening, as I was shelving books near the back of the library, I heard it again. But this time, it was different. The whispers weren't just coming from the shelves around me, they were coming from inside the books themselves. I could hear the words, not clearly, but enough to make my stomach churn. I walked over to one of the shelves, my heart pounding in my chest, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. The whispering stopped, but when I opened the book, the pages were blank. There were no words, no stories, just empty parchment. I ran my fingers over the pages, trying to make sense of it, but nothing happened. As I moved to place the book back on the shelf, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't have opened it." I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The library was empty, and yet the voice had been so clear, so distinct. I set the book down quickly and fled to the front desk, where I tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had settled in my chest. Over the next few days, the library seemed to take on a life of its own. The whispering became more insistent, louder, more frantic. It felt like the books were calling out to me, begging for attention. At night, I would hear faint cries, low, mournful, desperate sounds that seemed to come from the bookshelves. I even tried to take a few books home to study them, but when I opened them at home, I found they were filled with gibberish, nonsensical scribbles that made no sense. The books in the library, however, would always return to their original state. Blank pages or faint whispers that would grow louder the longer I stayed. It was during one particularly cold winter evening, as I was preparing to leave for the night, that I finally understood the source of the whispering. The librarian before me, Mr. Harris, had warned me that the building had a history. He had worked there for decades and had always refused to speak of certain things. I had never understood why until that night. Why until I walked into the basement to retrieve some documents for the archives when I noticed something strange. One of the shelves was moved, and behind it, there was a narrow door I had never seen before. It was almost hidden, concealed behind years of dust and cobwebs. I pulled it open, my curiosity getting the best of me, and stepped into the dark room beyond. There, stacked high against the walls, were hundreds of books, books that looked old beyond measure, their spines cracked, their covers barely intact. But what struck me as odd were the books that weren't on the shelves. Piles of them were strewn across the floor, and some of them were open. I picked up one of the books and opened it, and immediately the room was filled with whispers. But this time the words were clear. The pages screamed at me, "Get out!" It was then that I understood. The library had a dark past, a past that had been buried in these very books. They were cursed, trapped in a cycle of torment, and anyone who spent too much time with them would fall victim to their whispers. They were feeding off the fear, the curiosity. They had been waiting for someone like me. I ran from the basement, the sound of the books whispering in my ears, and I never returned to that library again. To this day, I can still hear the faintest whisper when I walk past any old library, and I never go near them for too long. Because I know that sometimes when you open the pages of an old book, you might not just find words. You might find something that wishes you would never turn the page again. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more creepy stories. Which of these true stories gave you a chilling experience? Let us know. Until next time, Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are real.